It gives you an emotional separation from the outcome. A lot of comedians I hear, when they complain about stuff, they seem to imply that everything could be all right if we just do this or just do that. I don't care.
George Carlin's famous routine. 7 words you can't say on TV. When we learned that the Trump administration has come up with its own list of 7 words you can't say at the CDC.
This is actually insane, because what they did to George Carlin's legacy isn't just disrespectful, it's completely heartbreaking. And honestly, I'm getting chills just thinking about it. So picture this. You're scrolling through YouTube and you see a brand new George Carlin comedy special. Your heart stops for a second because wait, didn't he pass away in 2008? But there it is, George Carlin, I'm Glad I'm Dead, and it's getting millions of views. You click on it, expecting maybe some never-before-seen footage or something his family released to honor his memory. But instead, what you get is something that's gonna make your skin crawl, because this isn't George Carlin at all. It's a computer. An OWL program called Dudsy created an entire hour-long comedy special using artificial intelligence to mimic the voice, the cadence, and even the attitude of one of comedy's greatest legends. And when I tell you this story gets darker and more twisted, you have no idea what we're about to uncover. Now, before we dive into this mess, let me paint you a picture of who George Carlin really was, because understanding his genius makes what happened to him even more devastating. George Carlin was born in 1937 in Manhattan, and from the very beginning, his life was marked by struggle and pain that would later fuel some of the most brilliant comedy ever created. His father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family when George was just 2 months old. His mother, Mary, raised him and his older brother, Patrick, in a tough neighborhood they called White Harlem, because, as George later joked, it sounded a lot tougher than its real name. But here's what made George special. He took all that pain, all that dysfunction, and transformed it into comedy gold. He started performing in the late 1950s, working clubs and doing the traditional clean-cut comedian thing. You know, the suit and tie, the safe jokes that wouldn't offend anyone. But in the early 1970s, something incredible happened. George completely reinvented himself. He grew his hair long, traded the suit for jeans and t-shirts, and became this counterculture icon who wasn't afraid to say what everyone else was thinking, but too scared to voice. And let me tell you, this transformation came at a cost. When George switched from safe comedy to social commentary, he lost a huge chunk of his established audience. Johnny Carson banned him from The Tonight Show. He got thrown out of Las Vegas gigs for making jokes about his skinny ass. His Vietnam War material almost caused riots, but George didn't care, because he believed comedy should be more than just entertainment. It should make people think, challenge the status quo, and hold up a mirror to society's hypocrisy. Then came the routine that would change everything. 7 dirty words you can never say on television. In 1972, George was actually arrested and charged with disorderly conduct after performing this bit at Milwaukee's Summerfest. But that arrest led to something historic, the Supreme Court case CCC versus Pacifica Foundation in 1978. Which was literally about George's routine and the government's power to censor content on public airways. This one comedian from New York basically changed the entire landscape of free speech in America. But you know what? Success didn't make George's life any easier. In fact, the more famous he became, the more his personal demons caught up with him. He had his first heart attack in 1978 at just 41 years old, driving his daughter Kelly to school when he felt his jaw tighten. That's how she found out her dad almost died in the car on the way to school. And this wasn't his last brush with death. George had heart attacks in 1982 and 1991, required an ablation procedure in 2003, and had multiple angioplasties throughout his life. And here's where the story gets really tragic. While George was conquering the comedy world, his personal life was falling apart. His first wife, Brenda, had a serious drinking problem, and combined with George's own substance abuse issues, their home became a nightmare for their daughter, Kelly. She later described living with her parents as walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring their moods and withdrawal symptoms, sometimes even having to help sober them up. Can you imagine being a kid and having that kind of responsibility? George later admitted that his drug and alcohol problems weren't just personal disasters. They completely destroyed his finances. He owed massive amounts of money to the IRS because he'd neglected to pay taxes for years while he was using. It took him 18 to 20 years to dig himself out of that hole. He had to stay on the road constantly, doing show after show, not because he loved touring, but because he desperately needed the money to pay off his debts. But here's what makes George Carlin truly remarkable. He turned all of this pain into purpose. His later comedy specials weren't just funny, they were profound social commentary. He talked about everything from religion to politics to the absurdity of modern life, with a level of insight that most philosophers would envy. Routines like "The Planet is Fine" and "It's a Big Club" became legendary because they weren't just jokes, they were truth bombs wrapped in humor. George's relationship with death was particularly complex and fascinating. After 9/11s, he had to completely scrap a routine he'd been working on called "I Kinda Like It When a Lot of People Die," because the timing was obviously inappropriate. The routine, which wasn't released until 2016, showed George's darker side, his fascination with disasters and human mortality. But even in these dark jokes, there was always a deeper point about media sensationalism and society's morbid fascinations. As George got older, his comedy took on an even more nihilistic edge. He started wearing all black, grew his hair longer, and began making jokes about violence and death that made some of his longtime fans uncomfortable. During one particular show at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas in December 2004, he went off on the audience so brutally that someone shouted, "Stop degrading us!" George's response was basically to tell them off, and he walked off stage to face real consequences for the first time in years. The MGM Grand fired him that night, and then came the shock announcement: George had checked himself into rehab for pain medication addiction and alcohol abuse. The angry, nihilistic comedy wasn't just a creative choice, it was a symptom of deeper problems that were destroying him from the inside. But George managed to clean himself up one more time. His final HBO special, "It's Bad for Ya," was filmed in 2008, just 4 months before his death. Watching it now, knowing what we know, it's almost eerie how he talks about death and aging with such dark humor. He won a posthumous Grammy for that special, which feels both fitting and heartbreaking. On June 22, 2008, George Carlin died of heart failure at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, California. He was 71 years old. His death came just 1 week after his final performance at the Orleans Hotel and Casino. According to his wishes, his body was cremated and his ashes were scattered in front of various New York City nightclubs and over Spofford Lake in New Hampshire, where he'd spent summers as a kid winning drama awards at camp. The comedy world mourned the loss of not just a great comedian, but a true artist who'd used his platform to challenge authority, question everything, and make people think. His influence can be seen in countless comedians who followed, from Jon Stewart to Bill Hicks to countless others who use comedy as a weapon against hypocrisy and injustice. Which brings us back to this owl abomination that's got everyone so furious. In January 2024, this podcast called Dudesy, hosted by Will Sasso and Chad Culkin, released an hour-long owl-generated comedy special featuring George Carlin's voice. The owl had been trained on all of Carlin's material, his voice patterns, his timing, his attitude, and was programmed to create new material on topics George never got to address, like mass shootings and billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Now, you might think, okay, that sounds kind of interesting, like a tribute or something. But here's where it gets absolutely infuriating. They didn't ask George's family for permission. They just took his voice, his likeness, his entire comedic persona, and used it to make money without any consent from the people who loved him most. George's daughter, Kelly Carlin, was understandably devastated when she found out about this. She posted on social media, "My dad spent a lifetime perfecting his craft. From his very human life, brain, and imagination. No machine will ever replace his genius. These owl-generated products are clever attempts at trying to recreate a mind that will never exist again," she continued. "Here's an idea. How about we give some actual living human comedians a listen to? But if you want to listen to the genuine George Carlin, he has 14 specials that you can find anywhere." Can you imagine how that must feel? your father, who poured his heart and soul into his craft, who suffered through addiction and health problems and financial ruin, who literally changed the world through his comedy, and some podcasters just decide to use technology to puppet his voice for their own gain. It's like digital grave robbing. But the family didn't just express their outrage on social media. In January 2024, George Carlin's estate filed a federal lawsuit in California against Dudsy, alleging copyright infringement and violation of Carlin's right to publicity. The lawsuit described the All Special as not a creative work, but rather a piece of computer-generated clickbait which detracts from the value of Carlin's comedic works and harms his reputation. The estate's attorney, Josh Schiller, said something that gave me chills. "I'll risk becoming a tool that allows bad faith actors to replace creative expression, to exploit the already existing work of creators, and to get rich at the expense of others." This isn't just about George Carlin. This is about what happens when technology allows people to steal the essence of what makes someone unique and use it for profit. And here's what makes this even more disgusting. This wasn't even Dudy's first attempt at this kind of exploitation. They had previously created an Al-generated stand-up routine featuring Tom Brady's likeness, but Brady's legal team threatened action so quickly that the video was removed. They knew this was legally and ethically questionable, but they did it anyway. The response from the comedy community was swift and brutal. Comedians, writers, and performers who had been inspired by Carlin came forward to condemn the Al Special. Many pointed out that what made George special wasn't just his voice or his delivery, it was his humanity, his pain, his personal experiences that informed his worldview. And all can mimic the surface elements, but it can never replicate the soul of someone who lived through poverty, addiction, multiple heart attacks, and decades of fighting for free speech. But this controversy touches on something much bigger and more terrifying than just one Al-generated comedy special. We're living in an age where technology can essentially bring people back from the dead without their consent or their family's permission. The Writers Guild and Screen Actors Guild spent months on strike in 2023, partly because of concerns about Al being used to replace human creativity. And cases like this show that their fears were completely justified. Think about what this means for the future. If someone can create an hour-long George Carlin special using Al, what's stopping them from doing the same thing with other deceased legends? Could someone create new music by Tupac or Johnny Cash? New movies starring Marilyn Monroe or James Dean? New books by Mark Twain or Maya Angelou? Where does it end? The technology exists now to not just preserve our digital footprints, but to actively puppeteer them long after we're gone. And unlike previous forms of exploitation, this isn't just using someone's image or music. This is attempting to replicate their consciousness, their thought patterns, their entire creative process. It's the ultimate violation of what makes us human. George Carlin spent 50 years of his life perfecting his craft. He survived childhood trauma, addiction, financial ruin, multiple heart attacks, and the constant pressure of being one of America's most controversial public figures. He earned the right to rest in peace when he died in 2008. But now, 16 years later, some podcasters decided they could just press a button and make him dance for their entertainment and profit. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is that George himself would have had some choice words about this situation. He was always suspicious of authority, whether it was the government, the church, or corporate America. He spent his entire career fighting against people who tried to control, manipulate, or exploit others for their own gain. The idea that someone could use technology to literally put words in his mouth after his death would have enraged him. And the fans aren't having it either. The comments on the Al Special are brutal. People are calling it disgusting, disrespectful, and an insult to George's memory. Many longtime Carlin fans are saying they can't even watch it because it feels too much like witnessing a desecration. Others are pointing out that George's real material is readily available and that there's no need for some artificial recreation when the genuine article exists. The legal battle is still ongoing as of now, but it's already serving as a landmark case for how we handle Al-generated content using deceased celebrities' likenesses. The outcome could set important precedents for protecting the rights of families and estates when technology tries to resurrect their loved ones without permission. But beyond the legal implications, this whole situation raises profound questions about death, legacy, and what we owed to the people who have entertained and inspired us. George Carlin gave us everything he had during his lifetime. He shared his pain, his insights, his anger, and his wisdom with the world. He earned the right to be remembered for who he actually was, not for what a computer algorithm thinks he might have said about current events. The tragedy here isn't just that someone used Al to exploit a dead comedian's voice. The real tragedy is that we live in a world where that's even possible, where technology has advanced to the point where the boundary between the living and the dead can be violated so easily. George Carlin's comedy was about being human in all its messy, complicated, painful glory. And Al can never replicate that because Al has never been hurt, never been addicted, never faced mortality, never struggled with the fundamental questions of existence that drove George's greatest material. So when his daughter Kelly says, "No machine will ever replace his genius," she's not just talking about comedy. She's talking about the irreplaceable value of human experience, human suffering, and human insight. George Carlin wasn't great because of how his voice sounded, or his timing, or his delivery, though those were all masterful. He was great because he was a human being who had lived through incredible pain and found a way to transform that pain into something meaningful and beautiful. The Al version is just a hollow echo, a cheap imitation that misses the entire point of what made George special. It's like someone painting a copy of the Mona Lisa and claiming it has the same value as the original. Sure, it might look similar from a distance, but it's missing everything that made the original a masterpiece. The human hand that created it, the historical context, the artist's personal vision and experience. And that's why fans are so furious. It's not just about legal rights or intellectual property. It's about respect for a man who gave his entire life to his art, who suffered enormously in both his personal and professional life, and who deserves to rest in peace without having his voice hijacked for someone else's profit. The saddest part is that George Carlin's real legacy doesn't need any artificial enhancement. His 14 HBO specials, his books, his albums, and his influence on countless other comedians speak for themselves. He changed American comedy forever, fought landmark battles for free speech, and left behind a body of work that will be studied and appreciated for generations to come. So next time you want to hear George Carlin's voice, don't give views to some Al knockoff. Go watch his real specials, read his autobiography, Last Words. Listen to his albums, support the comedians he inspired who are still alive and creating new material. Because the best way to honor George Carlin's memory isn't to try to bring him back from the dead, is to appreciate the incredible gift he gave us during his lifetime and to make sure his real voice is never forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, this whole controversy will serve as a wake-up call about the ethical implications of Al technology and our responsibility to protect the dignity of those who can no longer protect themselves. Because if we don't draw the line here, with a case as clear-cut as this, where do we draw it? George Carlin spent his entire career warning us about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of questioning authority. Maybe it's time we took his lessons to heart and started asking some serious questions about who gets to control the voices of the dead. What do you think about all this? Is there ever a situation where Al recreation of deceased celebrities is okay? Or should this be completely off limits? And how do we balance technological innovation with respect for human dignity and family wishes? Let me know in the comments because this conversation is far from over. And honestly, I think George would want us to keep talking about these big questions long after the headlines fade away. Don't forget to like this video if it made you think and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most important conversations are the uncomfortable ones.